Hi class, starting a new video for the new lectures for week 8. I made a couple updates to the schedule, and I'm starting to kind of create the schedule for the rest of the semester. Obviously, it's a little bit of a bummer that we have to kind of scrap some of the physical computing stuff, but we're going to work with what we've got. So I have a new project. So we kind of finished up this animation project, or we will finish up the meme project. That was project 2. So we had the first version, then the interactive version, and then the animation version. So we're gonna move on from that project and start a new project, project 3. Okay, so I have the next 3 weeks. I'll continue to add to this as I kind of add material to the site. For this week, we're going to be covering 2 new concepts using a loop and using random. We'll have an assignment related to this, just creating some variations of a drawing. You guys can choose what you want to do for the drawing. You can do something abstract. You could do like a self-portrait. You could do, one of the options is that you could do like a series of windows on a building, like anything that's kind of like repeated. Oh wait, I'm not on camera. Repeated with some variation, or something like that we could do. So I'll do a couple examples of different types of assignments you could do. So I'm going to close the video and get started with the loop. Okay, so I'm going to get started with a new project, and we're going to be talking about loop. So this is the notes for week 8 loops, and I'm going to kind of go over what the basic syntax for a loop is, and then I'll show some different things that we can use it for. So I'm going to create a new project first so I can do some of these examples inside the project. So I'm going to open up GitHub as usual to get started and switch over to MMP 210. And I'm going to go ahead and show my folder in the Finder. Okay, so I have some of my old projects. I'm just going to go and add a new project here. So I'm going to add in a project called Loop. And I'll do a couple different examples of this. So the folders that I have in my project might not match the folders that you need for the assignment. So I'll try to make that clear. You can do as many folders as you want, obviously, as long as you turn something in for the assignment. So I've got loops set up. I'm going to go to open in Sublime Text, so I'm just going to click on that. So we're open in Sublime Text, and I'm going to add a link to the new project in my landing page. So here's all the links to the meme. I'm going to go to a new line and just add a link to the new loop project. So maybe I'll put a line break there so it's easier to see where each section starts and ends. So I'll add a list item and then add an anchor tag. And the hypertext reference is loop. And then I'll say loop example. And the second one I'll do when I add in randomness, I'll call that sort of my pattern example, version 1. So we'll be working on a pattern over the next 3 weeks. And so code is a really useful way to create patterns, and so we'll be doing that. So I'll have some examples and then some things that look more like finished assignments. So I'm going to open this up. So I'm going to go to Tools and go to my Sublime server. It looks like I've actually already got the Sublime server running, but if I didn't, I could always stop or and then start. And so now that I've got that going, I can go over to the browser and go to localhost 8080. And so we have the Sublime server open. I can click on MMP 210. And then I'll just click on the loop example, and there's not going to be anything there right now, so we got to put some stuff in there, and then we can edit it. So to start, I'm going to open up the console because I am going to be showing some stuff in the console. So I'm going to increase that a bit, and then let's start our project. So the first thing I want to do is add in my P5 library, p5.min.js, as well as the index. I can just copy that, no need to redo that, and then the style page. So I'll just take index, p5, and style. Really, all of those files are pretty much the same in all of my projects, so it doesn't matter which folder I take it from. So I'm just going to copy that, and then go to loop and paste. And then I'll edit those files to make sure we know we're on the loop project. So I'm going to close this tab and then go to loop, go to index.html. So let's just change this to loop example, and I'll change the h1 to loop example as well, and then everything else can stay the same. Actually, I don't need this font anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of that. I'll just delete that. I happened to copy that over from the meme where I was using that font, but I don't need that any longer. So then I have my HTML page. That looks good. If I refresh this, we see the page, but obviously I haven't created sketch.js yet, which is why we get this error over here. And so we're going to make sketch.js and do a couple examples. So back in Sublime, I'm going to make a new file, Command-N, and then Command-S to save. And I'll save this as sketch.js. And before I actually start making my JavaScript file, I'm just going to do a couple examples in the console of kind of demonstrating a couple things. So let's actually talk about what a loop is. So let's go into the notes over here. So a loop is basically just a JavaScript construct that defines a pattern or a thing that happens repeatedly. So basically anytime you want to do things more than once, you want to use a loop. And I'll show an example of what I mean in a few minutes. So in JavaScript, there's a couple different types of loops. There is the do loop, the while loop, and the for loop. The one that we're going to use the most is the for loop. It has sort of the simplest syntax, and it's the easiest one to kind of screw up. I'm going to use the while loop just as a quick example, because it looks very similar to some stuff that we've seen before. And then we'll convert a while loop into a for loop, and then we'll use that to do some drawing. So let's start off with the while loop. And here's the example. So this is what one of your conditional statements would look like. So this is something that we covered a couple weeks ago when we first started doing interaction with the meme. We used conditional statements to detect if we were clicking the mouse or separating our canvas into different sections. So if I want to write a simple conditional statement in my code, I would just say if, and then a condition. So let's make up a condition, 1 equals 1. So if 1 equals 1, then let's do a alert to say 1 equals 1. And so alert is just a JavaScript function that will create an alert in our browser. So I'm going to reload the example, and we'll see, okay, 1 equals 1. Okay, so that's in case of a true statement. If I say 1 equals banana, that's going to be false, and so nothing happens when I refresh the page. So that's our basic if statement. We have if just tells JavaScript that we're about to evaluate a condition. Then we have the parentheses for our condition. So this will either be true or false based on what we put in here. And then we have the code block that starts with these curly brackets. So anything that goes in between these curly brackets will run only if this condition is true. So then to convert that into a loop or a repeated statement, all we really have to do, well, we have to do a few things, but one thing that we have to do is just change that if into a while. So here we're doing some counting. So I'm going to start with a variable. I'm going to say variable I equals 0. So I in this case is just short for index, so we're just going to count. And so we're going to start at 0, and I'm going to say if I is less than 5, then let's log I in the console. So I'm going to log just the string I first and then the number I for what it actually is. So if we see that in our example, see, we get it once, I and then 0. So we get I is just basically a label in this instance, and then 0 is the actual value of the variable I. And since this is an if statement, nothing else happens because we just evaluate this. 0 is less than 5, so we log this, and then we're done. So if we wanted to actually do that more than once, or like use I to count or something like that, then we can use a loop. So one thing we have to be really careful about is including this I++. So what the I++ means is we add 1 to I. The reason we have to be careful about that is if we have a while loop with no, where I never changes, then we'll crash the browser. So if we say while I is less than 5, then I++, what we're going to see is I counts up by 1. So plus plus basically means I equals I plus 1. So if I is 0, we're saying I equals 0 plus 1. And so then I becomes 1. And so we count up by 1 each time. So I becomes 1 plus 1, 2 plus 1, 3 plus 1. And we keep going until 4 plus 1, that equals 5. Okay, so then when I is 5, 5 is no longer less than 5. Okay, so that's when the loop stops. So while this thing is true, the number I is lower than 5, then we keep repeating the code. And so what happens after each loop is it basically says, is I less than 5? Then it runs this code, and then it goes back to the beginning. That's why we call it a loop. So instead of having to like copy and paste the code 5 times or something like that, we just keep going around as long as this statement is true. So let's take a look at that in our console. So we get I is 0, I is 1, I is 2, I is 3, I is 4. So just as for the sake of demonstration, if I were to take out this I++, so I'm going to put a comment there so it's not happening, and I reload the page, you'll see what's going to happen is it's actually going to crash my browser. So this number right here is just going to keep counting up and up and up because it just keeps going and going and going, but it never stops because I never changes. So the reason I'm showing this is if this does happen to you, which it probably won't, but just in case it does, the way that you stop this is you can go to the menu in Chrome and go to More Tools and go to the Task Manager. And in here, you'll see all the different things that Chrome is doing, all of the various windows and stuff. I have a lot of other tabs open in other places. But you can look for the tab that's creating the problem. And one easy way to find that is to click on the CPU, and you'll see right here, this loop example is taking up 121% of my CPU. That's obviously bad. And you can actually maybe hear on the microphone, my computer, the fan is starting to get louder and louder because I'm basically breaking my computer. So I'm going to click End Process there. And so that's really bad. We don't want that to happen. It's going to take my computer a second to kind of like slow down and not be so annoyed. So if you have that issue, just open up this Task Manager. You can get rid of it. And you might also want to restart your computer, but I think it'll be okay. So I'm going to close that out and bring I++ back, and then reload the page, and we're back to normal. So again, we're counting, starting I equals 0, and then we just count up each time. So, remember that I is just a variable name. It's a useful one because you can think it's short for index, and we can just use that to count. So anytime you want to do something more than once, it's a good idea to use a loop, and you can count with that loop by using I, or sometimes you use other variables. So that's a while loop. And part of the reason we don't use the while loop is because what I just showed you, because our first statement, the I equals 0, and our while statement and our I++ are all in different places, it can be kind of easy to create a problem like that. Like, what if I forgot that I was using I and I used like J or something like that? It's very easy to create what's basically called a Stack Overflow where you crash your computer. So we want to avoid that. And to avoid that, what we're going to use is a for loop. And basically a for loop is pretty much exactly the same thing as a while loop, except we use the word for as the keyword instead of while. And then we put all of our conditions right into the parentheses next to each other. So we can really easily create a for loop here. I'm just going to change while to for. And then I'm going to take this variable I equals 0 and cut that and put it as the first condition. And then I'm going to put a little semicolon right here and then put the I plus plus at the end. I actually don't need this last semicolon. So I have the first statement, semicolon, second statement, semicolon, and then the third statement, and then the semicolon. And this will do exactly the same thing as my for loop. So we just count I0, I1, I2, I3, I4. And so basically, that's what we'll be using in the class. So when you see for, just think we're going to repeat something. So repeats something. And the code in here, you can pretty much write anything that you want to in here, but you know it's going to happen more than once. So I wouldn't want to do like an alert here because it's going to happen, 5 times. So it's better for drawing. You probably wouldn't want to do something like that in here. Anyway, whatever you do in there, it's going to repeat however many times you count. One other thing that's a little different here is the let. And so usually when we're using a for loop, we use let. I won't spend too much time going over this because we don't really need to know that much about it for what we're working on. But basically what let does, it's the same thing as var, except when I say let I, that means I only exists in here. So if I say console.log I after this, so let's put in a little label, let's say this is after, what we'll see is that I doesn't exist anymore. I is not defined. Okay, if I use variable I, that var is a little different. Instead of just creating I for the for loop itself, it creates I for the whole program. So if I make I here, then it'll still exist after the for loop ends at this curly bracket here. So we still see after I is now 5. So the reason we want to use let here is that way we can use I again later, and we don't have to worry about this I down here being the same as this one up here. So we can get rid of that. Okay, so there's our basic loop. So let's go over a little more detail on each of the statements in the loop, and then we can use it to do some drawing. So the first statement is the initial condition. That's where we start counting. Most of the time you're going to see this, let I equals 0, but really that condition can be whatever you want. So if we're just counting and we don't actually need to know the number, usually we start at 0, but this could be 1, this could be 100, this could be -1. This value can be anything, but we usually just start at 0 because usually we're just like counting, and in computer programming we always start counting at 0. The second statement is the condition. And this one is a little tricky because basically if this condition is true, that means the loop keeps going. And so when we create the condition, we actually have to think about when do we want the loop to stop and then create the opposite of that. So if we want to count 5 times, then we start at 0 and then we count up. So 0 plus 1 is 1. Plus 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3, plus 1 is 4. And then 4 is actually, the end of our loop, because 4 is the last time that I is less than 5. So 4 is less than 5, that's true. So we go again. But then when we get back to the beginning, now when I equals 5, 5 is not less than 5. It's the same. So then that's when we stop. So it's a little confusing because we're counting to 5, but what we're talking about is we want to be less than 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So as long as this statement is true, we keep going when this statement is false. So if you wanted to count to 10, you would change that number to 10. And so we'll look at a couple other examples of different conditions. The last statement is how much you count up by. So in this case, we're counting up by 1. Plus plus is shorthand for 1. So that would be the same thing. But we don't always have to count by 1. We could count by 2s. So we go 0, 2, and then 4. And then, once we would get to 6, 6 would not be less than 5, so we would stop there. So you'll almost always see plus plus here if you're dealing with just counting by 1. But sometimes when you're drawing graphics, you might see like plus equals 50 or plus equals 100 if you're dividing your screen up into pixels. So those are our 3 conditions: the initialization condition, where we start counting; the conditional, which is essentially when we stop counting; and then the iteration, sometimes called the update or the increment statement. And then everything that happens in between those 2 curly brackets is what we repeat in our code. Let's see if we can figure out how to count in different ways. So if I wanted to count from, let's say, 100, or let's say I wanted to count from 1 to 10, what would I have to change here? So you can pause the video and try that, or you can just keep watching. So right now, I'm counting from 0 to 4. And if I wanted to count from 1 to 10, I'd have to change this to a 1, right? So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So then you might think, oh, I'll change this to 10. Okay, but I only get up to 9. So remember, if 9 is less than 10, then we stop. Or sorry, when we get to 10, 10 is not less than 10, so we stop. But there's 2 ways I can fix that. One is I can just change this to 11. So from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then we stop when I is 11. Or I could actually change this greater than sign to greater than equals. So I can use any of those different types of operators there: less than, greater than equal to, less than equal to. Okay, so now I get 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. Okay, so then if I wanted to change this to 100, I would just do 100. However, whatever number we say there is how many times we're going to loop. So then another thing is I can actually count backwards as well. So what if I wanted to count down from 100 to 1? Well, the first thing I'd have to do is make sure that I'm actually counting the right way. So 100 is less than or equal to 1. That's false, right? 100 is much bigger than 1, so this loop would never even start. So first we have to change this value. So I is greater than or equal to 1. And then as we're changing, if we go up, we'll always be greater than equal to 1. So we'll create another crash. What we want to do is count down. So we'll do I minus minus. Okay, so now we start counting I at 100. And then we count down, 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 all the way to 1. So you can really change those parameters to count any number, any direction, however you want. All right, so now we're ready to get into drawing with loops. And I'm just going to do this rest of the part in the code because you can kind of follow up with this later. So I'm going to create my loop example sketch. So I'll just leave this here just as a note, and then I'll start my sketch. So this is my loop example. This is on March 23rd, 2020, but it'll probably be posted tomorrow on the 24th. So I'm just going to make a simple drawing to start. I have my functions set up as usual, and I'm going to create a canvas. I'll just do a typical 640 by 360 canvas. And then I'm just going to do a function, draw. And I'm just going to start, I'll do a background, maybe light blue. And then I'm just going to draw an ellipse at, say, 100x and 100y and 50 pixels wide. Okay, so there's my circle. So let's say I wanted to draw, 10 more circles or 5 more circles. Probably, I would just copy and paste that code and then move X over, right? So I would just grab this without using a loop. Like before we knew that this existed, if I said you had to draw 5 of these, you'd probably just copy, paste, 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 paste. So you have 5 more. And then maybe just do 200, 300, 400, 500. Okay, so that's not so bad, but it's a little tedious, and there's definitely better ways to do this. So we can start to think about how would I repeat this, since these circles are all basically the same thing. Instead of having to just write the same code and then do a bunch of math to figure out what the new x values are, how could I actually repeat this using code? So first of all, we have to figure out what's the same with our loops. So the y values are all the same. The sizes are all the same. The only thing that's changing is the x value. Okay, so the x value goes up each time. So let's try taking a variable for x. So I'll say variable x equals, and then I'll use 100 as the starting point. So then I'll say x here. So then, this is x plus 100. 300 is x plus 200. 400 is x plus 300, and 500 is x plus 400. So now we get the same ellipses. We still have a bunch of code. In fact, we've just added more code. So how can I simplify this even further? Well, each time I'm going up by 100, right? So I could just say x plus equals 100. And then I could take out that. I could take out this. Whoops. I could take out that. Going a little too fast. Okay. And I could take out that. So now I have the same ellipse, ellipse at x, ellipse at x, ellipse at x, exactly the same code, and I'm just adding 100 each time. Okay, and so then we've basically created most of our loop, right? So we can turn that into a loop really easily just by adding our for. So we can say, put for in front of this, maybe change var to let. So x equals 100, and we know how much it increases. We don't know how much it stops, but we could say x is less than whatever 100 times 5 is. So let's say 500. We might need to actually do like less than or equal to 500, and then take our increment that we created here and put that there. And remember, that one doesn't need a semicolon. And then I take that ellipse code and put it there, and then the rest of the stuff I don't need anymore. Okay, so there we go. We have our ellipses. And now we can change our code really easily. Like if I said, actually, I want to have, I want to start at 0, I can just put x at 0. So now my ellipses start earlier. If I want to go all the way across the canvas, I can change 500 to width. And now I can make changes to my ellipses without having to change 5 lines of code. If I decide I want them to be, at 50y, I can just change one number, or I can put them, in the middle of the canvas at 180. If I want them to be bigger, I can change this number, and it'll change all of my ellipses. Or if I want it to be smaller. So now I can make these changes to a bunch of different circles really quickly just by changing one number instead of updating a number in 5 different lines of code. So using a loop really gives me a lot more flexibility to start to think about how I want my design to look. I can also change this number just to make a lot more ellipses. Okay, so I'm moving, instead of going up by 50 pixels or 100, I'm just going by, every 20 pixels. So let's map the conditions that we're using to what we actually see on the screen. So I'm going to increase the size here and here. So I'm going to move this over a bit down here so we can see them both. So basically what we're saying is we start with x equals 0, right? So that's 0 right here. Remember, x is this way, and so 0 is right here. And so that first ellipse is x equals 0, and y is 180, so that's the same for all of them. Y is 180, and then we just add 100 each time. So we draw an ellipse. The x value is 0, so then we can make the comparison. Is 0 less than width? Well, 0 is over here, width is over here, so it's definitely less than width. So then we add 100. So here's 100 pixels. That's the new value, x equals 100. And then we compare it again. Is 100 less than width? Yes, that's still true. So this is still less than over here. So then we go up another 100 pixels. And so we keep doing that until right here, this is probably 600 here. And then so the next one would be 700, but that is greater than the width. Width is right here. 700 is over here somewhere. So that's when we stop. So when we're no longer less than the width. And so that's how we can kind of know that we're still drawing on the canvas and know how many circles we have, and also change, the space in between them as we're doing the loop. So that's basically how the loop works. Having a bunch of circles isn't very exciting. So what we can do is start to, create some patterns. So let's make a little face just as an example. So I'm going to turn on no stroke, and I'm going to give this ellipse a color. I'm going to say fill is plum. Okay, and I'll make it a little bit bigger. Let's say like maybe 100 or maybe 80. Okay, and then we can start to add inside of these circles to create a pattern. Okay, so I've got, maybe we're making like a little face. So this is the face, and we can make some eyes. So I can make another ellipse. I'll do a different fill. I'll say fill is pink. So I'll make another ellipse. I'll start at X, put it in the same place, 180, and we'll make it smaller for an eye. So this is the left eye. Okay, so now they all have like a little eye. Let's actually change that color. Let's try gold. Okay, so now they have an eye in the middle. It doesn't really look like where an eye should be, so let's move it over a little bit. Let's just take that X and add 20 to it. Okay, so that looks a little more realistic, and maybe we'll move Y up a little bit. Okay, so that's pretty good. Maybe move it back down a bit. Okay, so that's actually looks like the right eye. So let's make the left eye. So I can do pretty much the same thing, but like we did with our self-portrait, I'll go in the other direction with that one, and there's my left eye. Okay, so now I have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 versions of the drawing because I'm looping across the whole width of the canvas. So let's add a mouth as well. So I'll do a rect here. I'll say X, and I'll go up a little bit on the Y. We'll do 200, and I'll make it kind of wide, 40. Do 10 for the height. Do 5 for the corners. So it's a little bit off because I forgot the rectangle draws from X. It draws this way. It's not centered like our circles. But we can change that a bit. Like maybe I'll just move it back a bit so it can stay off-centered, or that's centered. What if we move it back 10? So that's kind of off-centered, but maybe that kind of looks cool. We can leave it like that. And so now we have a little bit of a pattern. It's not that exciting because we still can add some more to it, which we'll do in the next lesson with random, but we can start to create a pattern, and you could start to see how maybe you could use this as the design for the background of a t-shirt, or some socks, or something like that. So this is a way that code makes it a lot easier to create patterns and than it would be to do to copy and paste in Illustrator or something like that. So then if we want to adjust the pattern, I can make things bigger or smaller just by changing these numbers as well. So we'll get into more interesting variations in the next lesson, but one thing that we can do is make some changes based on the Y position. So if I want to do some variation, like I want them to get bigger, I could have like a variable, let's use let since we're starting with let, for size, and I could actually set that relative to X. So if I just set size to X, and then I use like size for the face, and maybe size over 4 for the eye. And so for size, I have to use division, so it's relative. So size over 2, and size over, I guess that would be 8. And this would be like size over 16 or something like that. So now we can see the faces get bigger. That's a little too big, so maybe I would do x divided by 2 so it doesn't get so big so quick. Oh, and I guess I did different things here. That's kind of fun though. I can leave it like that. Maybe I'll do x divided by 4. So we can start to add a little bit of variation, but it's always going in the same direction because basically x is increasing that way. I could also, do some variation on the y. So I could say let y equal x, maybe divided by 10. And then I could put y in here, put y minus 10 in here, y minus 10 in here, and y plus like 20 here. So then we can create some variation on the y-axis as well as the size. So that type of variation isn't super exciting. What we can do in the next lesson is add randomness to it, and that'll be a lot more interesting. I'll stop here, and then we'll take a look at that. So I could also, change the y value by putting by starting somewhere and then adding x. Okay, so this face here gets a bit distorted because these values are still hard coded over here, but that's kind of cool. We're seeing some kind of development happen this way. I don't know why I guess this, whatever x value this was, is too small because x is 0, so everything is just 0. So yeah, that's okay. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and upload this, and I'll include links to this in the description, and then next time we'll add randomness to this. So I'm going to go over to GitHub. I'm going to say adds loop example, commit to master, and push to origin. And so check out the YouTube description for those links.